All right, diving right in today, we're talking about something really important, especially when it comes to things like pharmaceuticals and dietary supplements,
Hmm,
quality risk management,
you got it.
or as everyone calls it, QRM.
Yeah, that's it.
And we're really looking at this as like a proactive way of thinking in manufacturing to make sure that all the things we need, to be safe and effective actually are.
Right. It's not just about, checking off the regulatory
Yep.
boxes, but really kind of fundamentally changing the way we think about potential problems. Like,
Yeah.
how can we tackle these things before they even become a problem?
Right, get ahead of them.
Exactly. And so today, in this deep dive, we're going to really be exploring some of those core principles of QRM and some of the practical tools that people use. We're going to be looking at things like regulations, like 21 CFR parts, 110, 111, and 211.
Big ones.
Yep, the big ones.
Yeah.
And some industry guidelines as well, like ICHQ9, which is kind of the big one when it comes to quality risk management.
Yeah, kind of the Bible, so to speak.
Yes, exactly.
So basically, we really want to give listeners an idea of how manufacturers are ensuring the quality and safety of their products
Yes.
using this whole framework of QRM, which is super important.
Exactly.
So to get us started, I guess the first thing we need to do is define it.
Right.
For someone who's never heard this term before, what exactly is quality risk management?
Yeah, that's a great question. At its core, quality risk management, or QRM, is really a systematic process. It's how we can assess, control, communicate, and review risks to the quality of a drug product throughout its entire life cycle.
Okay, the whole
The
thing.
whole thing. So from its initial development all the way through post-market, when it's actually with the patient.
Wow.
And yeah, ICHQ9, which is an international guideline on quality risk management, really lays out this framework for us. And one of the most interesting things about QRM is that it really emphasizes being proactive.
Okay, interesting.
So it's not just about reacting to problems when they happen, but it's about identifying those potential issues and mitigating those risks before they ever occur.
So almost like predicting what could potentially go wrong.
Exactly. And using scientific understanding and data to do that.
Got it.
And it's not meant to be a separate activity either. It really needs to be integrated directly into the pharmaceutical quality system.
Okay, so it's woven into the whole fabric of how things work.
Exactly. It's not an add-on. It's fundamental to how quality is managed.
So if we have this really systematic approach to looking ahead and trying to identify potential problems and really integrating it into how everything functions, what are some of the principles that guide QRM?
Right. So ICHQ9 highlights two really key principles that underpin QRM. The first one is that the evaluation of risk should be based on scientific knowledge, experience with the process, and ultimately it links back to patient protection.
Right, because that's the whole point at the end of the day.
Exactly. So we're not just going off of gut feeling or, just assumptions. We're really basing it on evidence and data,
Yeah.
and always with the patient as the main focus in mind.
Right, so data-driven decisions.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And then the second principle is that the level of effort, formality, and documentation, all of that is in proportion to the level of risk.
So it's not a one-size-fits-all.
Exactly.
It's really, scaling the response to the level of concern.
Right. Because we don't want to be spending tons of time and resources on, a small issue, but we want to be putting a lot of effort if it's a big risk.
Right, prioritize.
Exactly. Prioritize the highest risks.
Okay, so that makes a lot of sense. You really want to be smart about how you use your resources.
Exactly.
Okay, so now that we've kind of got an idea of what it is and the principles that guide it, how does this all work in practice?
Right. So the risk management process, it generally follows several stages,
Hmm.
which are outlined in ICHQ9. And those are risk assessment, then risk control, then we move on to risk communication, and finally risk review.
Got it. All right, so 4 main stages.
Exactly. Exactly. And let's start with risk assessment.
Okay.
That's where we identify and analyze those potential risks to quality. And really, it's a three-part process.
Okay, so let's break that down a little bit. What are those 3 parts?
Okay, so the first part is hazard identification.
Okay.
This is where we're asking what might go wrong.
Okay.
So we're really brainstorming all those potential things, those hazards
Yeah.
that could impact the quality of the product.
That could be anything from, the equipment to the people.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So like you said, equipment, people, maybe the equipment hasn't been cleaned properly.
Mm.
Maybe there's an issue with the environment.
Yeah.
Maybe there's the possibility of mix-ups, maybe with the raw materials
Right, right.
or even the labels on the product.
Yeah.
And then we also think about deviations from the manufacturing process itself.
Got it.
And actually, regulations like 21 CFR Parts 110, 111, and 211, they highlight a lot of these areas
Okay.
where hazards could occur. Things like
Okay.
sanitation, proper material handling, all of those are really important.
So the regulations actually point to some of the potential concerns.
They do. They do. They give us a good starting point for what to look for.
Okay, so that's hazard identification. Then what's the next step in the risk assessment process?
So once we've identified those hazards, then we move to risk analysis.
Okay.
And here we're asking, okay, what's the likelihood of that harm actually occurring?
Okay.
And if it does occur, how severe would the impact be?
Right, so how bad could it be?
Exactly.
Mm.
And sometimes we even consider detectability, which means could we catch it before it causes a problem?
Oh, right.
So this involves looking at historical data like, have we seen this before?
Right. Have we had issues before?
Exactly. Also theoretical analysis, kind of thinking through what could happen.
Right.
And then getting expert opinions from people who really understand the process.
Right, the people who are actually doing this day in and day out.
Exactly. Exactly. And even stakeholder concerns. So really getting input from a variety of sources to understand what the potential impact could be.
So you're not just, sitting in a room by yourself coming up with this stuff. You're really going out there and trying to get a comprehensive view.
Right, because we want to be as thorough as possible. Right.
Makes sense.
Yeah. And then the third part of risk assessment is risk evaluation.
Okay.
So here, we're comparing the risk against some predetermined criteria. So is this risk, is it acceptable or is it unacceptable?
Based on those predefined criteria.
Exactly. And this helps us to prioritize, which risks do we need to address most urgently?
Right, triage.
Exactly. Exactly. So we can focus on the most important ones first.
Okay, so we've identified our hazards, we've analyzed the risks, and then we figured out which ones are the most important to address.
Right.
So what happens next?
So the next stage is risk control.
Okay.
And this involves two main strategies. So we have risk reduction and then we have risk acceptance.
Okay, so two sides of the same coin.
Yeah, exactly. So risk reduction, that's all about taking actions to lower the probability of that harm happening
Okay.
or the severity of the impact if it does happen.
Oh, if it does happen, it's not as bad?
Exactly, exactly.
Yeah.
So some examples, we might improve cleaning and sanitation procedures.
Which is super important.
Very important.
Yeah.
And actually, it's mandated in regulations like
Yeah.
21 CFR 110.
Okay.
The design of the equipment is important too, so we can clean it easily.
Right.
We might separate work areas physically,
Okay.
so we don't mix things up. And that's something that's highlighted in 21 CFR 211 and also by experts like Leonard Steinborn, who we've talked about before.
Right, right.
And then, of course, proper material handling and storage.
Always important.
Very important. Again, that's covered in 21 CFR 110. So lots of different things we can do to reduce risk.
So these are very concrete things that we can do to minimize those chances of something happening.
Exactly,
Yeah.
exactly. Now, sometimes, we might do all we can to reduce a risk, but we just can't get it any lower.
Right, right.
Or maybe the cost of reducing it further just doesn't make sense
Right.
compared to the benefit we get. So in those cases, we might formally accept the risk.
Okay, interesting. So you're not ignoring it, but you're saying we acknowledge that this is a risk and we've thought about it, and this is why we're okay with this level of risk.
Exactly.
Okay, that makes sense.
Yeah, so we've documented it, we've thought about it, we've made a decision.
Right.
And then finally, we have the last two stages, which are risk communication and risk review.
Okay.
So risk communication is all about making sure everybody knows about these risks and what we're doing about them.
So everyone's on the same page.
Exactly. And then risk review is about, checking in on those risks regularly.
Okay.
So it's an ongoing process. We want to make sure our risk control measures are actually working.
Right, because things change.
Exactly. Things change all the time. So it's a continuous cycle of assessing, controlling, communicating, and reviewing.
So you're always kind of keeping an eye on those risks.
Always, always.
Okay, so earlier you mentioned that there's some specific tools that manufacturers use to help them with QRM.
Right.
Could you tell us a little bit more about those?
Yeah, so ICH Q9 Annex 1 actually gives us a whole bunch of different tools and techniques that we can use for risk management.
Okay.
And these range from very basic stuff,
Okay.
like, drawing flowcharts,
Right, right.
to map out a process or using checklists
Right.
to gather data, all the way to some more advanced techniques.
Okay, so let's talk about those more advanced techniques.
Sure, yeah. So one very common and very powerful tool is FMEA.
Okay.
failure mode and effects analysis.
Okay.
And we've talked about FMEA before with Mike Lay Brown, who's an expert in this
Right.
area.
Right.
But basically, FMEA is a systematic way to identify potential failures in a process or in a piece of equipment,
Yep.
and then to analyze the effects of those failures and figure out what might be causing them.
So it's really looking at all the different things that could go wrong and then what would happen if
Yeah.
they did go wrong.
Exactly, exactly. And then another really popular tool, especially when we're focusing on hazard prevention, is HACCP,
Okay.
hazard analysis and critical control points.
Okay.
And this one's mentioned in ICH Q9 Annex 1,
Okay.
and also in regulations for food manufacturing, like 21 CFR 110.
Got it.
But basically, HACCP is all about identifying those really critical points in a process, the points where we absolutely have to have control to prevent a hazard.
So it's like, if these things go wrong, we're in big trouble.
Exactly.
So we really need to make sure that these points are controlled.
Exactly. So we want to focus on those make or break points.
Got it.
And then we have some other tools like risk ranking
Yeah.
and filtering,
Okay.
which helps us to prioritize risks if we have a lot of them.
Right. So when you're overwhelmed, you need to kind of figure out which ones are the most important.
Exactly. There's also fault tree analysis, which is a kind of a visual way of showing how different things could lead to a failure.
Okay.
And then there's hazard operability analysis, or HAZOP, which is a very structured way of identifying hazards and operational problems.
Okay.
So there's lots of different tools, and the key is to choose the right tool for the job.
Right. And it depends on what you're looking at and the kind of information that you have available.
Exactly.
Okay, so that's a great overview of some of the tools. Now let's bring this back to the actual manufacturing floor.
Right.
How does all of this get applied in practice?
Yeah, so QRM really has a big impact on manufacturing. First of all, it helps us to make better decisions.
Okay.
So by doing these risk assessments, manufacturers can be more proactive about how they design their processes, what equipment they choose, and how they allocate their resources.
Right, because if you understand where the risks are, then you can put your resources where they're most needed.
Exactly,
Yeah.
exactly. And that includes things like equipment qualification and validation, which are so important.
Right, making sure the equipment works properly.
Right, and we've talked about this before, but the risk assessment can actually determine how rigorous the qualification process needs to be.
Okay, so not every piece of equipment is treated the same.
Exactly. It depends on the risk it poses to the product.
Got it.
And then another really important thing is that QRM fosters a culture of continuous improvement.
Okay.
So by always looking for areas where we can improve and then monitoring those changes, we're constantly getting better.
So it's not just a one-time thing. It's an ongoing process.
Exactly. It's a cycle of planning, doing, checking, and acting.
Right, that makes sense.
Yeah, and then of course, QRM is essential for regulatory compliance.
Okay.
So it aligns with the expectations of GMP.
Good manufacturing practices.
Yes. Good manufacturing practices for pharmaceuticals and dietary supplements. And the regulations like 21 CFR Parts 210 and 211 for pharmaceuticals and 21 CFR Part 111 for dietary supplements, they don't always use the term QRM, but they definitely imply it.
Okay.
Like they require a risk-based approach in many areas, like equipment qualification, process validation, change control, and handling deviations and corrective actions.
So it's not just a good idea, it's really part of the law.
Exactly. It's not optional.
Got it.
And then finally, the principles of QRM, they can be applied to everyday practices on the manufacturing floor.
Okay.
So for example, with sanitation, we can have risk-based cleaning procedures.
Okay.
So instead of just cleaning everything the same way, we identify high-risk areas and focus on those.
Right, so it's more targeted.
Exactly, more targeted. And that's outlined in 21 CFR 110.
Okay.
And then with material management, we assess the risks associated with raw materials, with suppliers, and storage conditions.
Right.
Even equipment maintenance can be prioritized based on risk. And James L. Vesper, who we've talked about before, he emphasizes that calibration schedules should be risk-based too.
Okay.
So we can see that QRM really permeates every aspect of manufacturing.
Yeah, it really does seem to touch everything.
It does. It really does. And even in the lab, we apply QRM principles to method validation
Right.
so that the tests we use to check the quality of the product are reliable,
Okay.
and also to how we qualify and calibrate lab equipment,
Okay.
which is in regulations like 21 CFR Part 111 and other GMP guidelines.
Got it.
And when we need to make changes, QRM helps us to assess the potential impact of those changes, which we call change control.
Okay.
And when we have rejected materials, QRM helps us to figure out what to do with them.
Right.
And that's outlined in regulations like 21 CFR 111.425 for dietary supplements.
So QRM is really about thinking ahead and making sure that everything is done in a way that minimizes risk.
Exactly, exactly. It's about being proactive, systematic, and data-driven.
Got it.
Let's think about a hypothetical example. So imagine a manufacturer is making multiple products using some of the same equipment,
Okay.
and they do a risk assessment and realize there's a potential for cross-contamination.
Okay.
So using QRM, they might decide to buy dedicated equipment for some of the products,
Okay.
or they might implement stricter cleaning procedures between batches.
Right.
And that way, they're mitigating the risk.
Got it.
And another example, let's say a manufacturer is choosing a new supplier for a raw material.
Okay.
They do a risk assessment, and they find out that the new supplier might have some quality issues.
Okay.
So what do?
Well, they might need to do more testing.
Exactly. They might implement stricter testing requirements for the raw materials from that supplier.
Got it.
And that aligns with regulations like 21 CFR 211.84.
Okay.
So those are just a couple of examples of how QRM can be used in practice.
Yeah, those examples really help to kind of see how it all comes together.
Exactly. It's not just theory. It's actually happening in real life.
Right. So as we wrap things up, what would you say are some of the key benefits of taking this proactive approach with QRM?
Yeah, so the benefits are huge.
Okay.
First of all, it leads to better quality and safer products.
Which is, of course, the most important thing.
Absolutely. Absolutely. It also improves efficiency because we're focusing on the things that matter most.
Right. So you're not wasting time and resources on things that aren't as important.
Exactly.
Mm.
And of course, it helps us to comply with regulations, which is really important for any manufacturer.
Right. Keeps you out of trouble.
It does. It does.
So QRM is really not just a burden. It's actually a really valuable way of doing business.
It is. It really is. It's about making sure that the products we use are safe and effective, and that's something we should all care about.
Absolutely. This has been a really fascinating look at quality risk management.
It has.
And it's so clear that it's not just a bunch of rules. It's really a fundamental framework for making sure that products are of the highest quality and safe for people to use.
Yeah.
So to wrap things up, I guess we'll leave listeners with this thought. Think about all the products that you use every day,
Right.
from food to medicine to everything in between.
Right.
The principles of identifying risks and mitigating them, which is what QRM is all about, are probably at work behind the scenes to make sure that those products are safe and effective.
Absolutely. And it makes you wonder what other areas of our lives could benefit from this kind of thinking.
That's a really good question. Something to think about.
It is. It is.
Well, this has been a great deep dive. Thanks for joining us.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
And we'll see you next time.
See you next time.